Hey everyone, we're here for our next session. We have Ian Myers, founding scientist at Zcash, also at Aleo and Bolt Labs, uh, professor at University of Maryland. He'll be doing a talk on Satoshi needs more than a mask, the state of privacy on the blockchain, and I'll let him take it from here.
Right. So, hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction. As you heard, my name is Ian Myers. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, and I've been working on privacy in cryptocurrency since about 2011. Zcash was, in fact, my PhD thesis. And every so often now, I find myself giving this talk on, what's the current state of privacy on the blockchain. First gave this at ZCon 0, I think, and then one of these at the Ethereum at DevCon, and now I'm giving a revision of it. And things sort of change a bit every time, but unfortunately, they also stay depressingly the same in terms of how much progress we've really made on a non-technical level. So for those of you who don't know, cryptocurrency has a privacy problem, right? Because everything is public on your blockchain, the thing is effectively Twitter for your bank account. All your data is available to anybody, right? Your creepy ex-girlfriend or boyfriend, your business competitors, governments that may be out to get you. And I don't say that as in like, us versus the government. I mean, if you're a government and your economy is running on a blockchain, then you are probably worried about other governments spying on you, right? Basically, your data is exposed to everybody. And so that is sort of the motivation for why we want privacy and why we need privacy. And so the question is, well, how are we doing at that? How good is privacy on the blockchain? And on the technical level, we've seen some interesting progress. There have been a bunch of new zero-knowledge proof systems, which have basically all been used to build privacy-preserving smart contracts and also just privacy-preserving payment systems, which are basically zero cash. My PhD thesis with newer and better and cooler snarks and a bunch of other tricks in them. And that's really cool, right? I've watched that stuff take off for a long time. On the other hand, we've seen talk of governments banning and or backdooring private P2P transactions. And this is sort of saddening to me, especially because I think some people in the cryptocurrency community actually are encouraging this, right? Their idea is let's get blockchains to get adopted and get regulatory approval. And in order to do that, we'll throw privacy coins under the bus. And as I'll get to in a moment, this is actually a pretty big mistake and we should stop that. If you know anybody who's saying that, please tell them not to. And finally, we're still debating what kind of privacy tech we need, right? If decoy-based privacy systems, these are things like CoinJoin or Monero, work, right? And we're doing this even though no one actually uses the techniques that people think defend against the obvious attacks. And we're doing this despite the fact that, for example, Grin's privacy was shown to be completely broken. And this was something that people have been warning about for years, right? That these kind of approaches didn't work. And we finally saw an actual deployed system fail for them. And finally, on a sort of similar technical note, but actually on a slightly more positive one, Mobilecoin is apparently launching soon. And so this is interesting because if you know anything about it, it actually combines a couple of interesting approaches. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to cover these topics briefly, right? So first of all, right, why is Twitter for your bank account a bad thing? Why do we actually need privacy? And the obvious answers that a bunch of you have heard, and I hear there are actually a bunch of cryptographers in the audience, so this is probably old ground to at least you, is we need individual privacy, right? You want privacy from governments, from stalkers, you want privacy from theft. Right, this is the basic, like if the amount of money you have is public on a blockchain, someone might show up and steal your money. But these concerns are things that we see in our daily lives in a bunch of places. And frankly, we don't have too much privacy in a lot of those roles from a lot of people. So you'd be forgiven if you thought that this wasn't that much of a problem. Like it really is a problem. But again, I wouldn't blame you if you thought, well, who cares? However, there was a unique problem specifically for cryptocurrency, which is fungibility, right? And I'll explain this by way of a story. So there was a Portland strip club, per this headline, that got in trouble with the federal government, with the US Secret Service, in fact, for only giving customers $2 bills and change. And in fact, it went further. It dyed them red. And the reason for this is that, of course, if you had these $2 bills that were dyed red and everyone in Portland knew were from a strip club, you were unwilling and unlikely to spend them in other places. So basically, when they gave you change, you were pretty much locked into spending it only there because your money was tainted. And this is a good example of what property economists call fungibility, which is in order for an economics currency system to work, you really want every single unit of currency to be interchangeable, because then they have the same value. And cryptocurrency doesn't have this property by default, because every single transaction is public and you can tell where money came from. You can look at it and see that it has a history. And this has some problems. It means, for example, that if you do a transaction for a legitimate sale, say you're selling beef jerky or something online and someone buys it with Bitcoin, you may find out that you are not able to deposit those Bitcoins at your friendly neighborhood exchange because 10 transactions before that, they were involved in a darknet market or something else. And so now you found out your money isn't worth as much as you thought it was. And so this just basically breaks the entire thing of an economy. And this is, as a result of this, coins just don't have a history, right? Coins that are freshly mined in Bitcoin and Ethereum and such trade at a premium because they're not going to be subject to these kind of checks. So this is another reason why you want privacy. But the most fundamental one, which is kind of obvious, but I think everybody forgets, is if we don't have privacy, you're going to end up with centralization, right? You'll still have a cryptocurrency, but it's going to be centralized. And the reason for this is no business, nobody who's actually using this thing to conduct economic business is going to want to put all the financial details online if they can avoid it. Right? And this holds for normal day-to-day businesses that exist today. This holds for things that you can start to do on a blockchain. So even the trading firms that are doing decentralized exchanges and such, we've seen all kinds of problems with the fact that all the transaction data is public. You get front running, you get these minor extractable value problems. And so people are going to try to avoid that as best they can. And this is like a force of nature. You are not going to be able to do anything about it. They will get privacy one way or another. So what are they going to do? Well, the minimum thing is they're not going to put their data on a public layer one. So either you get a private layer one, or if that doesn't happen, if, for example, you've sold, privacy on layer one under the bus to be able to get regulators to approve your blockchain or your token sale, whatever it is, well, then people on your platform are going to still get privacy. They're just going to have to do it using exchanges, and they're only going to use the exchanges they trust. Or they're going to do it using L2s, like layer twos, again, off-chain, but only with operators they trust. And so this is not a thing you can get around, right? You really do have to make serious inroads to provide privacy, or we're going to end up with transactions being centralized around either exchanges or layer two operators who are reputable. Because fundamentally, privacy is also a trust property. If you don't have privacy, then whoever you're interacting with, you have to trust them not to abuse the information you're revealing. And this is a point that we all need to get through our heads, or else we're going to end up in a world where privacy-preserving transactions are in fact frowned upon by governments. So where does that leave us? What do we do? Well, there are a number of different ways to get privacy-preserving transactions. And if any of you have seen a talk I gave at DevCon 2 years ago, one of the common ones is this approach, which I call decoy-based privacy. And the idea with this is that you basically make a bunch of noise on the blockchain and hope that nobody can figure out what's going wrong. And I've been explaining to people why this isn't private for about 3 years now, and it still isn't private despite what's going on. But the message has been, I think, a bit misunderstood. So blockchain 101, right? In Bitcoin or Ethereum or anything else, if I want to make a payment to a merchant to purchase something, in order to show that I have the money, I have to identify where that funds came from. I have to point to the UTXO, in the case of Bitcoin, that paid me the money. I have to identify the source. And this is inherently why Bitcoin has a privacy problem, right? And so what do you do about this? Well, in Bitcoin, the data is public. In the decoy-based approaches, instead of saying, hey, look, I'm spending this money that somebody paid for me, and you can see the transaction that paid me. In these approaches, you are going to say, well, this might have been the source of my money, or maybe there are a couple of other decoys that might have been, and I'm not going to tell you which. You sort of obfuscate the situation a bit. And then finally, there is the zero knowledge approach, right? This is what was taken in Zcash in my PhD thesis, and subsequent cryptocurrencies have run with it, right? Where instead of identifying what's going on at all, you erase all this data. You just give a zero knowledge proof that there exists some transaction, some unspent transaction output, UTXO, in the blockchain, and you make the payment. Right? And so these are this is still the state of what we have for privacy on the blockchain. These are the basic main approaches. Do nothing, do some kind of mixing, right? This is what CoinJoin does. This is what RingCD does, which is what's used in Monero. Or you can do the zero knowledge approach. This is what's used in Zcash. It's what's used in proposals like Aztec and others on Ethereum. And so the question is, do you really need the zero knowledge approach? Because that has some heavyweight cryptographic engineering. And so a number of systems try to just do decoys. And intuitively, this looks like it might work, right? Because if you make a payment to a merchant, right, the merchant sees that your transaction might have had 3 possible origins. And then that might have had 3 possible origins, each one of those. And so it gets this tree that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And you might look at this and intuitively go, okay, that's good enough. But the issue is, it isn't, right? Your intuition is wrong. And it's very easy to show you basic examples of where this goes, where this breaks, right? Because this tape tree that you have, right, of all this data, right, it actually goes both backwards and forwards. And there's actually a fair amount of information in here that you can use to figure out what's going on. And the thing I want to convince you is that you shouldn't think about these things intuitively, that you really do need to do the actual analysis and listen to the experts and figure out what's going on. Because to give you just one example, right, there are a lot of things that can go wrong here, right? One thing you can do is identify merchants who are trying to stay anonymous. So suppose you're a dissident, you're a democracy activist in an oppressive country, say in the Middle East. And you want to take donations to support your activism. So you have a Twitter account, you have an email, you have a blog, all of which are very carefully set up to be anonymous because the government in this country that you're operating in wants to arrest you or worse. And so you have this presence online that is not under your real name, and you want to accept donations to support it. And so you're going to take these donations and you're going to deposit them to an exchange. And the exchange is your local exchange that has all of your information and data and knows who you are because it has your banking details. And you would hope that decoy-based privacy systems actually keep this safe, right? Because this is a thing people really do use, CoinJoin and Monero and such for doing, is this kind of scenario, right? Where they want to stay online and take payments for whatever they're doing, but keep themselves private. And the problem is that this just doesn't really work, right? Because what an attacker can do is they can make a donation to you or purchase whatever it is you're selling, right? And they can do this repeatedly. And then they can wait until you cash out your money into an exchange. And the sort of intuition you might have about a decoy-based system is that it should be fine, right? That, well, even if Bob, this dissident, deposits one of these tracking payments to the exchange, right? And the exchange looks and says, oh, Bob deposited this thing that, if you look back at all the tree of decoys, you can see this thing in here. Bob has plausible deniability. Bob can say, oh, well, it wasn't me. I could have picked this by a decoy. It just was happenstance. You have no idea what's going on. And indeed, that is kind of true if Bob just does this once. But if Bob, this dissident, deposits all of this money, right, all 3 of these payments, well, what are the odds this happened by accident 3 times, right? And, maybe the odds are actually still pretty good. So then your attacker can just keep doing this repeatedly and repeatedly again and again, and the probability becomes negligible. So it becomes quite easy to track people. And this is really bad, right? Similarly, another thing you can do if you're in this position is you can track users, repeated payments to merchants, right? So if you're a merchant, you're accepting payments anonymously, you can realize that all these payments with all these trees of decoys actually come from a common origin because someone had to fund their wallet from a particular exchange, and then they've linked together. You don't have privacy. And perhaps even more insidiously, if you're an exchange or a KYC company, you can collude and do this even if there isn't a common origin, even if you just know what's going on and know that these 3 UTXOs in the blockchain are from different people. And so the reality of the matter is decoy-based systems don't match your intuition. There are patterns in here, and a little bit of knowledge goes a long way. And so I've been giving this talk a couple of times now, and people seem to take this to heart. They seem to realize that there's some problems. But then a funny thing happens, right? When this discussion comes up online or in chat channels, everyone sort of goes and harps on the particular examples that I just gave you and says, well, maybe if you do this other thing, maybe if you do this third thing, you can kind of protect against it. And the answer is maybe, I don't know, for those particular attacks. But these are just a couple of examples. The structure of this data really makes this hard to do. And you should really think through what we mean by privacy and not just take a knee-jerk, good enough approach. And the reason for this is that problems will come and bite you. So my personal favorite example of this is Mimblewimble and Grin. So for a number of years, myself and others have been saying, Mimblewimble and Grin don't really provide pretty good privacy. The straw man example, which is, by the way, not technically accurate, is that they only provided privacy if you submitted your transactions directly to the miners. As long as anyone else can see any things, you'd have problems. But anyway, the general thing we were warning about is, look, these things don't have privacy. They don't work. And the response from the cryptocurrency community and enthusiasts was basically, well, it's fine. You can add enough decoys. You can make this thing noisy enough. You can get it to work. And basically, we're a bunch of people were just like, whatever, fine. We're not going to argue with you. And then somebody actually went out and really did these attacks, and they were able to quite cheaply de-anonymize 96% of Grin transactions. So privacy really, these attacks really aren't theoretical. They really do come up to bite you. And so decoy-based systems really don't match your intuition. And one of the things that I think has been missed in all of this is that the data that's out there is not tiny, right? Exchanges have a fair amount of knowledge about what you do, right? And it's worse than that because you might trust your exchange, but a lot of these exchanges use the same blockchain surveillance companies, right? And so all the data is getting funneled into a couple of, frankly, quite centralized providers. And those guys have like a God's eye view. And this should worry you because you're not really in a position to maybe trust these guys. They might turn evil, right? They might turn into sort of these evil kind of things, right? And we've seen this happen before, right? There was a long history of sketchy but quasi-legitimate companies providing hacking services to governments, right? These were legitimate, like Western governments. And then this stuff got more and more available and started to be used for ill, right? And you started to get the point where these kind of surveillance and law enforcement tools were now in the hands of very evil people, like, say, the Sudanese government, right? And by the way, this is not, a random stock image. This is actually an advertisement from a company that was going to do this, a company called Hacking Team, that ended up, in fact, selling malware to the Sudanese in violation of UN sanctions. And this may seem like a random digression to you, except Hacking Team is actually the same set of people, some of the same people, who now work at Neutrino, which is a blockchain surveillance company. And so really, we have a serious problem with these kind of decoy-based systems, and they aren't going to hold up well. This really is not a good idea. These things are not private. I should likely briefly mention that there are a couple of things that maybe make this a little better. There's a thing called Atlantis that is coming out that gives you a huge number of decoys, something like under 100,000. I think it's used in Beam and Zcoin. And in theory, this doesn't do anything, right? As an academic, I'd tell you that it just makes some of the attacks I described slightly harder, but isn't safe. In practice, it's a lot harder. And so it might work, maybe. It's not clear. And so on that note, I want to end on something a little different because this is actually sort of exciting to me, and I'm kind of happy that apparently they're finally going to launch, which is a thing called Mobilecoin. So Mobilecoin, which some of you may have heard of, is a privacy coin that effectively uses Stellar's consensus protocol and decoys, in fact, ring CT from Monero, basically, and SGX. And this is a little weird because, as I just told you, decoy-based systems don't work. And if you follow the news, SGX also doesn't really work. So is this completely a dead end? Well, actually, it turns out no. The privacy protections it gets are pretty good, but there's basically a major caveat, because the way this thing works is the decoys that you have are only visible to validators inside SGX, right? And so the validators erase that data after they're done validating a transaction. And so to everyone outside of SGX, it actually looks like a zero cash style ZK payment scheme, right? There's no data going around. Right? And so what does this mean? Well, we sort of have a fourth way of doing this stuff, because if you look at these decoy-based systems where, as I've told you, they're not private, well, what does Mobilecoin do? It takes all these decoys and it puts them in a view that can only be seen by the validators using SGX. And so if you're not the validators, right, if you're everybody else, this is completely opaque. Except for one problem. SGX is actually quite frequently broken. And in fact, this is a major problem. And the Mobilecoin devs knew this, right? So, right, what happens when SGX is broken? Well, as long as you trust the validators, you're fine. In fact, even if somebody breaks into one of the validators temporarily, because all the data gets erased, you're still fine. But if somebody comes in and persistently compromises one of these validators and sits around for a long time, then they get to see everything and they can build up this picture going forwards. And so this leads to an interesting problem, because Mobilecoin is private only if SGX is secure or you trust the node operators. And we know that SGX isn't secure, so this means you basically have to trust the node operators. And this to me leads to an interesting kind of trade-off, which is Mobilecoin is either permissioned effectively, or it's not really private. And I still think this is actually a pretty interesting approach, right? It's pragmatic. It's a way of balancing trade-offs. But the reason I'm putting this at the end of my talk is these trade-offs are likely to not be understood correctly. The debate when this thing launches online is going to miss a very important set of subtleties, right? And that is that ring CT, right, the decoy-based mechanism in Mobilecoin, doesn't protect against most breaks in SGX, right? For the cryptographers in the audience, right, it only basically gives you forward secrecy against a snapshot attacker, right? As long as a malicious validator with broken SGX can join and continuously monitor the blockchain, which is the thing you'd expect to happen in an open network, then you get basically no privacy, because all of the decoy-based, the flaws in decoy-based approaches, as I told you, apply, right? On the other hand, right, if that's not a problem, right, if you only are using trusted validators, then SGX is actually somewhat useful because it protects against someone temporarily compromising one of those validators or coercing them. So I think this is somewhat interesting, but I expect the discussion around it to take a long time to converge on what the true set of trade-offs are, right? And so this is my attempt to sort of inform people. And so on that note, actually, I am now done. So let's see, what questions do I have? So it looks like all of this is just chat. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, what to do about people using privacy for illegal stuff? So this is an interesting question. The first answer is, look, people are going to use anything you build for illegal stuff. People use the automobile for illegal stuff. People use it to rob banks, right? Major problem. And yet we still have cars. So at some level, I want to tell you that this is just the reality of technology. Unfortunately, there is a debate going on right now about whether governments are going to allow, we're going to put serious restrictions on privacy coins. They're going to require KYC of on-chain transactions. And currently speaking, this is not the case, right? Privacy coins are completely legal, right? Zcash is listed on Gemini, which is like one of the more strictly regulated crypto exchanges in the US, right? So regulators have actually signed off on this kind of stuff. But there is a question of whether that changes in the future. And this is a problem. What's the most feasible thing Zcash could do to improve its privacy? This is a question from Dara Hopwood. It's a good question. I think on a technical level, in terms of the tools that are available, we're in an okay shape. The problem is we don't have adoption. Nobody is using this stuff. And by the way, I think this applies to everything that's coming out recently, and also to the new technology that people are announcing in this talk, right? We can build all these new technically razzle-dazzle things that fix whichever particular problem we want. Maybe it's more efficient snarks, maybe we remove trusted setup, but none of these things are going to actually provide people with features and get them to use this thing. One of my co-authors and co-founders of Zcash, Ron Tromer, said, selling people on privacy-preserving transactions is a lot like selling people on seatbelts for cars in 1910, right? It's not something that's on their mind right now. It's clear that maybe in 50 years when cars go faster and all the infrastructure is there, they'll need them. But right now, nobody's thinking about it. And so I think in order to get privacy to get people to use privacy-preserving currencies, we have to move to things where there's actually demand. So instead of focusing on privacy for just normal payments, which realistically no one cares about, maybe we need to look at privacy for DeFi. Maybe we need to look at stable coins, right? But we need to not just make narrow technical advances, because the reality of the matter is those won't fix the problem. And in fact, while we're working on those, we won't be making progress on usability and adoption and finding a product market fit. And this applies to I think everybody who's working in this space, not just Zcash or Monero or Grand or Member. It's a perennial problem. We kind of, in cryptocurrencies, tend to believe in magical progress through science and technology. And I think we are past that point here, and we need to have progress in other ways too.
Cool. So if there are any final questions, please drop in the chat. Otherwise, do you have any closing thoughts?
It's been an interesting process watching all of this go from basically there was Bitcoin to there's a huge amount of privacy tech out there. A lot of it building on the ideas that I worked out my PhD thesis. But really, technical progress alone on narrow cryptographic things is not enough to get this stuff to work. And we really do need privacy, because otherwise we're going to end up with a quasi-centralized financial system again. Even if it's on a blockchain, people will only deal with exchanges and layer twos that they trust. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Ian. This is really great. We're going to transition to our next talk now. Thank you.